You are never going to see anything like what we have just experienced for XRP ever again. What's unfolding right now is not just another market cycle or short-term narrative. It's something much bigger. And what's pretty much right around the corner, at least in my view, for XRP and for digital assets as a whole, is something all of you should be preparing for if you haven't already started. In case you missed my previous video from yesterday, we talked about a massive geopolitical shift that just took place. The United States is now gaining access to the largest oil reserve in the world. That alone changes everything. We're talking about billions upon millions of additional barrels of oil being produced every single day. And this has a very strong historical correlation with XRP and digital assets. When the price of oil goes down, XRP has generally gone up. The reason is simple. Lower oil prices lead to lower inflation. And when inflation drops, investors become more willing to take on risk. Risk-on environments are where digital assets thrive. This isn't speculation. This is macroeconomic behavior that is played out time and time again. And when you understand shifts like this early, that's exactly how you position yourself ahead of the crowd. Now, let's get back to what's actually happening here, because this is critical. The United States being able to produce millions more barrels of oil and supply that oil across the globe, quite literally everywhere, will absolutely decrease the price of oil. This is basic supply and demand. When supply goes up and demand remains relatively stable, prices come down. And that is exactly what Donald Trump wants. Trump wants inflation down, period. Oil is the lifeblood of the global economy. It's used to transport goods, manufacture products, generate energy, and power supply chains. When oil prices fall, the cost of virtually everything else falls with it. Food, transportation, manufacturing, housing, everything becomes cheaper. And that's the fastest way to bring inflation down without crashing the economy. That's why this moment is so important. I want to play this clip from Trump because it clearly outlines the plan now that the U.S. has leverage over this massive Venezuelan asset. Trump said, "We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country." That statement alone tells you everything you need to know. U.S. companies go into Venezuela. They rebuild and modernize oil infrastructure. They massively increase production. They sell that oil globally. The U.S. profits. Oil prices fall. Inflation comes down. It really doesn't get any more straightforward than that. Now, there have been some people in the crypto content space claiming that a spike in oil prices is what would cause XRP to go higher. I want to make this very clear. There is no logical or historical evidence to support that claim. U.S. companies harvesting the largest oil reserve in the world does not lead to a massive spike in oil prices. In fact, it leads to the opposite. Increased production leads to lower prices. And historically, lower oil prices are what coincide with rising digital asset markets, not the other way around. You can go back and look at the data yourself. I covered it in detail in the previous video. Every major period where oil prices fell meaningfully, risk assets, including crypto, performed extremely well. When oil spikes, inflation rises, central banks tighten, and speculative assets suffer. So, the idea that oil going up would somehow magically send XRP higher just doesn't hold up. What we are far more likely to see is sustained downward pressure on oil prices, which creates the exact macro environment XRP and digital assets need to thrive. But the Venezuelan situation goes far beyond oil. Venezuela also holds roughly 4 billion tons of iron, along with massive reserves of gold, silver, diamonds, quartz, granite, and other critical natural resources. These aren't small deposits. These are globally significant reserves that affect entire industries. Now that the U.S. has strategic control and influence, you better believe oil isn't the only thing they're looking at. Iron ore impacts construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Gold and silver impact monetary policy, reserves, and hedge markets. Rare materials affect technology, defense, and energy storage. When these resources are extracted at scale and brought into global supply chains, prices come down across the board. And once again, lower commodity prices equal lower inflation. That's the theme here. The United States is fully incentivized to lower the cost of goods and services worldwide. They want inflation down more than anything. They want interest rate cuts. And this is the fastest and most effective way to make that happen without destabilizing the system. Lower inflation opens the door to easier monetary policy. Easier monetary policy opens the door to liquidity. And liquidity is the fuel that drives explosive moves in assets like XRP. This is why what we're seeing right now is not just another headline. It's a foundational shift. These are the kinds of macro changes that only happen once in a generation. And when they do, the people who understand them early are the ones who benefit the most. This is not about hype. It's about positioning. And as this unfolds, the correlation between falling oil prices, declining inflation, rate cuts, and rising digital asset valuations becomes impossible to ignore. XRP sits right in the middle of that intersection. I mean, let's be honest here. The United States has a massive debt problem. This isn't political. This isn't speculative. This is just math. The debt load is so large that there are really only a couple of ways they can realistically manage it. Historically, they've always chosen the same path: lower interest rates and print more money. That's the playbook. That's what they've done every single time. And there's no reason to believe this time will be any different. That is their only real option. And believe it or not, that is incredible news for you, especially if you hold XRP. Every single time the US has lowered rates, expanded the money supply, and simultaneously brought down the prices of goods and services, what has happened? Digital assets have gone up every single time. No exceptions. It's one of the most consistent patterns in modern financial history. Liquidity enters the system. Investors look for returns. Risk assets explode upward. That's why, to me, this entire situation is one of the biggest blessings the digital asset space could possibly ask for. If you're someone who's been waiting for XRP to truly move, especially looking toward 2026 and beyond, this is exactly the type of macro setup you want to see. Now, one of the biggest questions people are asking about this oil situation, and I think it's a very fair question, is this: how long is it actually going to take for US companies to start producing this oil at scale? How long until it hits the market and begins to materially affect supply and pricing dynamics? Because obviously, none of this happens overnight. The truth is, Venezuela already has a significant amount of oil infrastructure in place. That's an important point that gets overlooked. A lot of the groundwork is already there. Some of it hasn't been used in years, and a lot of it needs serious upgrades, but the foundation exists. That changes the timeline dramatically. Assuming Trump moves quickly on this, which based on his track record, I think he absolutely will. We're not talking about years before production ramps up. We're likely talking months. At most, a couple of months before we start seeing production levels reach into the millions of barrels per day. And that's just the beginning. Once infrastructure is upgraded, modernized, and fully operational, production doesn't just stay flat. It accelerates over time. Output could increase exponentially as new operations come online and older facilities are brought back to life. We're talking about major US oil players here: Chevron, Exxon, and other massive producers that are already positioning themselves to gain exposure to this region. These companies have the capital, the technology, and the experience to scale fast. And when they do, the numbers get very serious very quickly. The potential production capacity of Venezuelan oil isn't in the hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. It's not even just a few million. We're talking tens of millions of barrels per day every single day. That's the scale we're dealing with here. And that's exactly what Trump wants. Because when global oil supply increases by that magnitude, The effect on price is unavoidable. It becomes an absolute fiesta in the oil markets. Prices don't just drift lower, they collapse. I genuinely think it's not unrealistic to see oil prices fall back to levels we haven't seen in years. $20 per barrel, maybe even $15 per barrel. We've seen it before, not even that long ago in the grand scheme of things. It might feel like ancient history now, but it really isn't. And for a lot of people watching this, it's probably been a long time since they've seen oil priced anywhere near that low. But markets are cyclical, and massive supply shocks create extreme outcomes. This is exactly that kind of shock. Now, the disruption in oil prices is really just the first domino. Oil is the lifeblood of the global economy. Like I mentioned earlier, it touches everything: transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, logistics, energy. When oil prices drop, the ripple effects spread everywhere. Lower oil prices mean cheaper transportation. Cheaper transportation means cheaper goods. Cheaper goods mean lower inflation. Lower inflation means central banks can cut rates, and rate cuts mean more liquidity. This is the full chain reaction. And when you zoom out and look at this over the long term, over the next 5-10 years, it gets even more extreme. Once the U.S. has fully ramped up production and optimized Venezuelan output, analysts are projecting something almost unbelievable. Some are saying that oil prices could eventually stabilize in a range between $3 and $6 per barrel. Now, I want you to really think about that for a second. If oil reaches $3 to $6 per barrel, the global economy as we know it changes completely. Inflation would be structurally suppressed. Energy costs would be negligible. Transportation would be dirt cheap. Manufacturing costs would collapse. And you have absolutely no idea what that does to digital assets. Bitcoin mining would go completely insane. Energy costs are one of the biggest expenses in mining. If oil and energy more broadly becomes that cheap, mining operations explode in profitability and scale. Network security increases. Institutional participation skyrockets. And XRP assets tied to global liquidity, payments, and financial infrastructure thrive in environments like that. The tailwind this would create for crypto would be unlike anything you've ever seen in your entire life. This wouldn't just be another bull market. This would be a structural repricing of digital assets at a global level. People are not ready for what that kind of macro environment would unleash. Cheap energy, low inflation, rate cuts, massive liquidity, global adoption accelerating, regulatory clarity improving, institutional capital flowing in. This is how once-in-a-generation wealth cycles are created. And this is why what's happening right now matters so much. It's not about tomorrow's price. It's not about next week. It's about positioning yourself before these shifts fully play out. Because by the time everyone agrees on the narrative, the opportunity is already gone. This is the setup. And I've got to say, this is going to be incredible. Truly incredible. We've only had a handful of moments in recorded history where oil prices dropped substantially enough to create a situation even remotely comparable to what we're looking at now. And every single one of those moments resulted in massive bull runs across global markets every time. This isn't theory. This is historical precedent. I went over this previously, but it's worth repeating because people still underestimate just how powerful falling energy prices are for risk assets. When oil drops hard, liquidity loosens, costs fall, and capital flows aggressively into growth and speculative markets. That's exactly how these cycles have always worked. Now, that doesn't mean everything is calm on the geopolitical front. Far from it. There are still very real tensions surrounding Venezuela. China is involved. Russia is involved. Everyone is making statements, flexing influence, and trying to position themselves strategically. But despite all the noise, one thing is very clear. This situation gives the United States a significant amount of leverage over China. Roughly 5% of China's crude oil imports come from Venezuela. That might not sound massive at first, But when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it becomes far more important. Russian reserves are continuously declining, and China is the largest consumer of that oil. Over time, that means China becomes increasingly dependent on alternative suppliers, and Venezuela sits right at the center of that equation. That dependency gives leverage, and leverage is everything in geopolitics. Whoever controls Venezuelan oil, the largest proven oil reserve in the world, holds a powerful bargaining chip in global political and economic discussions. That's the game being played here. This isn't random. This isn't accidental. Trump understands leverage, and this move is about ensuring that leverage stays firmly in U.S. hands. This is not financial advice. It's really that simple. Now, whether you personally agree or disagree with what's happening doesn't really matter. It's not within our control. And that's an important mindset shift people need to make. The markets don't care about opinions. They don't care about emotions. They don't care about what should happen. The markets care about reality. I'm adopting this phrase permanently because it's so true. The markets do not care about your feelings. They're going to do what makes logical sense based on global conditions, capital flows, supply and demand, and macroeconomic pressure. Our job isn't to debate it. Our job is to observe it. The smartest thing we can do is look at correlations, study historical precedent, understand how similar situations have played out before, and position ourselves accordingly. That's it. That's the game. You trade around reality, not around hope, fear, or ideology. And if you don't understand the relationship between oil, geopolitics, global conflict, monetary policy, and XRP, then you're going to want to pay very close attention this year. These things are not separate. They are deeply interconnected, and I'm going to be breaking that down step by step as this plays out, because 2026 is shaping up to be anything but normal. The kind of year where people either finally understand macro cycles or they get completely left behind. The signals are already there. Most people just aren't looking at them yet. As always, thank you guys for watching. Much love. I'll see you in the next one.